Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Erin Kolwitz and I'm the Director of Choirs at Northern Michigan University. I'm also the instructor for this new online course. Uh, Typically this course is offered as what we call a lab, and in our case we get together and we sing. But this semester we are not getting together to sing, which means that we're sort of doing something a little different and just transferring the content of this course, which is to be choral literature, especially of the masterworks, and transferring it online so that as many people can do this safely and with as much ease as possible. So hopefully you're all here and you've all received my links and links to the Google Drives and things like that. I'll be delivering content primarily that way. I will also put some things up on Educat, so you likely want to be able to have access to that, so we might have some discussion boards and things like that. Ultimately what will happen is each week I will upload a I'll upload a video, which I'm doing on Camtasia, and I'll just put that in the Dropbox for content so you can watch it whenever you want over the course of the week. Never a bad idea to start listening to the pieces that we'll be talking about, but the syllabus is online at Educat, so once you get registered, make sure you check out the syllabus so you know what we'll be covering and when. There is one instance where we will meet synchronously, and that is, I believe, in the third week when we'll have a guest lecturer on Zoom. So it'd be great if you could all meet on Zoom at that time, and I'll send you out the Zoom link and all that stuff as we get closer. Okay, well, let's just jump right in. So many of you know, if you've registered for this class, hopefully, that the first piece we're going to talk about is the Requiem Mass by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So many of us know who Mozart is, and many of us have heard of the Requiem. But there are some very interesting things that maybe some people don't know, and also some things that we've learned in recent years that historians have sort of dug up as to the revisions and the orchestration and things like that, which was primarily, we thought, done and finished by his student Süssmayr. That turns out not to be exactly the case. There's a couple other players involved in the finishing of this masterwork. But obviously the bulk of the credit goes to Mozart, who had all the sketches, the melodies, the harmonies sketched out. Mainly what was left unfinished was some orchestration and just a tiny bit of content. So we'll talk about that as we kind of go through movement by movement. But go ahead, grab a glass of wine, water, soda, whatever, and sit back and relax, and I'll do all the talking here. I should mention too that the K number 626 stands for Kirkel, which was the last name of the man that cataloged and organized all of Mozart's works. So we're pretty grateful to him for doing that, because Mozart has many, many works, and some of them have the same title and are in the same key. So for instance, Missa Brevis in D major, there are a couple of those. So it helps to have a Kirkel number so we know the difference, and that also gives us some idea of timeline as well. Okay, so a couple things to just talk about. Most of you already know a lot about Mozart. We know that he was a child prodigy. He was composing already at the age of 6, was pretty fluent on the keyboard, the harpsichord by the age of 5. People knew that he was kind of above average pretty early on, and a lot of historians and musicians put him through a lot of tests, and they all seemed to agree that he was what we would call a prodigy, or a genius, musical genius. He very quickly mastered every single medium and every single genre of the time period because he traveled so much. So as a young child, Leopold, his father, had he and his sister traveling all over Western Europe, playing for kings and queens, for the aristocracy, and things like that. And in doing so, he had been to Italy many times, and he had heard counterpoint, right? He had been to the Netherlands or the Low Countries, and he had heard their style of music. So he knew a lot of what was going on because he was so cosmopolitan. And as a result, just having heard it one time, he could basically recreate that style in his own music. So he very quickly mastered all of the genres, and that's pretty remarkable because not every composer wrote in every genre, but Mozart basically did. He mastered opera, he mastered choral music, he mastered symphonic music, chamber music, string quartets, harpsichord, concerti. He sort of did it all, which is really quite remarkable at this particular time. You probably also know his father was very domineering, very controlling, but he was a magnificent teacher and a composer and musician in his own right. He was a violinist. And so what he taught Mozart at an early age was quite remarkable. Granted, he had a pretty decent student to work with, but certainly he played a huge role in helping Mozart become what he is known to us today as a musical genius. He is the one that controlled their schedule. He is the one that controlled his sister's schedule. His sister, interestingly enough, was also a composer and was also a prodigy. But when she became a certain age, so in other words, an age where she could be married, he would no longer let her travel with them, and basically told her that she was not to be doing anything of any musical sort. All she had to worry about was getting married. So, product of the time, sadly, and we don't have any of her music. None of it survived. But she was a composer, and of course she just doesn't get a lot of credit. Another thing about Mozart that most of us know is that he was a bit of a difficult personality. He didn't mesh well with his bosses. If I were an armchair psychologist, I might say it's because of the relationship with his father. But he definitely did not get along with most people who hired him, particularly Archbishop Colloredo, who was in charge of Salzburg. So Mozart worked for him for a short time, for about 8 years, but it was very tumultuous, and they ended up parting ways. So around 1780 or so, he moves to Vienna and decides to become a freelance composer, which at this time is very, very difficult to do. If you were a composer, you were either you were paid by the king or aristocracy, the ruling class that might hire you to play for church, compose for church. They might hire you to compose for court. Those were really the only two options you had as a composer. So newly around this time, musicians were starting to sort of spread their wings and become freelance composers. But this was very, very difficult unless you were famous. And luckily at that time, Mozart had a pretty decent amount of fame. He was more famous than, say, Haydn, who'd been at it 24 years longer than Mozart. But initially he had quite a few gigs. He had quite a few commissions. Eventually that sort of went by the wayside. War and other things happened, and they ran out of money, basically. People ran out of money, and he could no longer make a living as a composer, and mainly made a living as a pianist. And at that time, he was in financial straits, dire straits. So what you might not know, though, is that Mozart composed just as much music as Franz Joseph Haydn, but in a much shorter time. So that is really remarkable in and of itself. Haydn was one of his teachers and regarded his musical talent very highly, but had commented on many occasions that Mozart was a difficult pupil. Mozart was often compared to Haydn, which Mozart was very flattered by because he really looked up to Haydn, particularly Haydn's string quartets, which are fantastic. If you haven't listened to them, there are many, many, many string quartets, but they are fantastic. And he really sort of idolized Haydn in that way. And Haydn, of course, looked at him as if he were a musical genius. Another interesting point is that Mozart and his sister Nannerl had a very strange relationship. It was at times very sexual, which of course was illegal and still is illegal, right? Yeah. Anyway, it's a little disturbing. If you read their letters to one another, it's a little risque. He would also go in and out of German. He would speak Italian. Mid-sentence, Mozart would flip languages. He would also turn the letter upside down. write on all different sides of the paper. It was very playful sort of way that they interacted with one another. As I mentioned, she was also a very, very fine keyboardist and a composer, but all of her music is now lost because her father would not allow her to continue to compose. One of the biggest things is that Mozart composed 600 compositions in 35 years, which is an unbelievable amount of creativity, an unbelievable, just in terms of mass production, that is an incredible amount of music in that short of time. So it shows that he was not just brilliant, but was very, very productive in his short amount of time. All right, moving on to his early life. We kind of already talked about this. This is Mozart's Geburtshaus, which is just German for birth house. That's an interesting place to go in Salzburg if you ever get there. It's a museum, and it really is worth your time. When you go to Salzburg and Vienna, everywhere you go, there's Mozart paraphernalia. So you can buy a Mozart pencil, you can buy a Mozart napkin holder, you can buy pretty much anything that has Mozart's silhouette on it when you go to Salzburg. They definitely have used that to their advantage. So I mentioned that he was on tour from the age of 6, basically, 1762 to 1773. This was sort of the first run that they all did together, back and forth, and this would have been Mozart's father, his sister, and him. Later, his mother would join on about a 3.5-year stint all around Germany. So his mother was there at times. Sadly, when Mozart's mother died, he was on the road. So that affected him deeply as well. So because of his education with his father and all of his travels, he was exposed to all this different music. One very large influence was Johann Christian Bach, which of course was one of J.S. Bach's sons that actually composed. Bach had many, many children, over 20. And out of that, only a few survived, and out of that, only a few became composers. Johann Christian was the one that seemed to really resonate with Mozart. He looked up to him and looked up to his symphonic content as well. He did end up studying some counterpoint when he was in Italy, so think about the Renaissance movement and sacred music that was very, very strictly focused on counterpoint, say like Palestrina, like Victoria, things like that. And now imagine it going even that much further through opera, the opera lineage. So he definitely took a lot of cues from the Italians, musically speaking. Sammartini, one of the very first symphony composers, was very influential for Mozart as well. And of course, he was able to meet these people and hear their music live and sort of soak it all into his own style. I mentioned his first job working for Colorado. In particular, he was not fond of writing church music. He did it, and there is a lot. As I said, his Missa Brevi is there's a huge amount of Missa Brevi that you can easily do with the church choir. They're very, very nice little pieces. In a few cases, he left out the viola because his bosses felt the viola was of the devil. So there are many that are orchestrated sans viola, which is a little interesting, but violas are sometimes hard to come by, so it might be to your benefit. He left the service of Colorado in 1780 because he had received a commission to write Idomeneo, and he was kind of going back and forth between countries. In Munich. He was summoned to Munich, Germany, and Colorado wanted him back, and he said, no, I'm not going to come back, and that was the end of that relationship, and thus was born his freelance career. So when he moved to 1780, as I mentioned, he had quite a few commissions, and he was extremely successful, particularly in composing opera. And of course, we know that he was very big in the opera buffa scene, which was the Italian comedic opera. And then he would sort of later go into Singspiel, which would be Die Zauberflöte, or the magic flute. So he was well versed in sort of the German styles and the Italian styles, and those were really sort of the two big players in Western Europe during that time. So he was lucky that he was able to do both and therefore receive a lot more commissions. He eventually did get hired by Joseph II, who was the son of Maria Theresa, who at that time was the man in charge of the Holy Roman Empire. So that gave him obviously quite a lot of exposure there as well. And really, the emperor's thinking was just he wanted to keep Mozart in his employ so that Mozart would not leave Vienna. He was worried about him being snatched up by another country, which of course was certainly a threat. Eventually a war, with the Turks led to a bunch of political upheaval and economic instability. So people suddenly did not have as much money as they once did, and then commissions, of course, fell by the wayside. So he made most of his money at the end of his life by playing gigs, actual piano gigs. A few commissions sort of thrown together here and there, but as his family grew, as he had more children and more expenses, he really found himself struggling. And his health was also deteriorating, particularly toward the end of his life. In 1790-ish, he was starting to have some real health complications. People think maybe it was because nutrition wasn't really a thing at that time, and he started to suffer. As far as his death is concerned, some people said he was poisoned, some people said he had lead poisoning. Mainly they think he had a fever, and he probably just became very ill and then passed away of sort of natural causes, as one might do in the 18th century. Okay, so let's talk about this piece. If you have not had a chance to sing the Requiem, I highly recommend it. It is an emotional, spiritual singing experience unlike many others. And Mozart is really the master, and he manages to find a way to dig really deep, and it's almost, as you're singing it, you're almost connected to him in some way, because this was basically his final project. So strangely enough, though, this was commissioned by a man named Count Walsegg. And his idea, he was sort of a layman's composer. He composed for fun, wasn't very good at it, but would often commission works and then pass them off as his own. So this was his goal with Mozart as well. So Mozart never actually saw him in person. He sent a servant to do all the negotiating and make all the arrangements and the details and things like this. And Mozart, being just a little bit paranoid, thought that this person was the messenger of death. Of course, he was not feeling well anyway. So someone shows up at your door, asks you to write a requiem. His mind, being creative, might have taken that just a little bit far. But you can definitely hear sort of the personality in this piece, in that it does feel very personal to Mozart, and I think that's one of the reasons why it resonates with so many people in so many ways. At the same time, he was working on Die Zauberflöte, the Singspiel I talked about earlier, which is the magic flute, and also working on La Clemenza di Tito, which is another tremendous opera. They're all really good, but they're all very long. That's something to keep in mind. The Marriage of Figaro is roughly 4 hours long. So he definitely did not use an edit pencil when he wrote. So know that you're in for the long haul, but certainly these operas are worth it, and they offer a lot of insight into Mozart's personalities and his compositional style. He was also working on a clarinet concerto at this time. So he actually had quite a few commissions there at the end, but he was exhausted, and he was traveling back and forth to Prague for premieres of other operas and things like that, and he probably was not taking care of himself in the best way, as he was also writing this Requiem, but he put a lot of it off. So imagine procrastinating and then writing the Requiem, which is basically what he did. So he decided to focus on it in the fall of 1791, and he was dead by December 5th of 1791. So he wrote the bulk of this work in a very, very short amount of time. Who were his compositional influences? Well, we consider Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, we call that the first Viennese school. And that's because most of them were centered in Vienna at this particular time. So that school of thought spread out and influenced a host of other composers. We put them in the same category because of their time period. Does not mean they were necessarily similar composers, although certainly they were writing what was in vogue at the time. Beethoven was a huge influence of Mozart's, and again, Haydn was as well. He had some lessons with Beethoven. He had lessons with Haydn. They both knew him to be very difficult. But looking backwards, Mozart was also very, very influenced by Johann Sebastian Bach, Johann Christian's father. So 100 years earlier, there was this remarkable composer by the name of Bach, and he didn't really get any recognition whatsoever until someone found his music and kind of dug it up. So pieces of Bach's were missing, but basically the thing that influenced Mozart the most was Bach's treatise called The Art of Fugue. So what Bach is famous for, of course, is his amazing ability to write these flawless fugues, and Mozart very much picked up on that style, even though maybe that would be considered a little bit of the old style or a little bit antiquated. Mozart incorporated this into many of his works and made it into a classical style. What's really interesting about Mozart is the way that he was able to develop characters, and the music that they sang sounded like the character. So he often used stock characters, right? So you have the ingenue, the young, innocent woman who, of course, is being courted by some handsome hero. In the case of Don Juan, also sort of a villain. And then you always have the funny character, the buffoon. Buffoonery was a very in vogue thing to incorporate into your operas at that time, especially comedic operas. So he used these characters, and the music often emulated their personality. So you might have heard of patter song. It's a way of singing that sounds like speaking, and he often used that with sort of the funny comedic character in all of his operas. So perhaps the butler or someone who plays a little lesser role, but they're the comedic role. So all these stock characters, which we see a lot of today in our modern productions and sitcoms and things like that, they all sort of have these stock characters, and he very much knew what he was doing and could be extremely expressive in the way that he wrote for them. So this is important to know because of the Requiem and the way he wrote the Requiem. Each of those movements has their own character. Each of those tiny little movements, the confutatis, right, Rex Tremende, all of them have an extremely different character. And he did that very knowingly and with great intent. So the unfinished symphony, how did this even get finished? Well, he passes away, and essentially his wife hands it off to a friend of his named Joseph Eibler. And Eibler does quite a bit of orchestration work, passes it back to her. She then gives it to two of Mozart's students, Jakob Freistetler and Franz Xavier Süssmayr. Süssmayr then proceeds to take all the credit for all of the additions and all of the things that were added after Mozart's death. So that's why to this day most people think that Süssmayr finished it, and that really is only because he released his own version after Mozart's death. There are many different editions now where people have finished it themselves in a different way, people who have sort of zhuzhed up what Süssmayr did. So there's a couple different versions of that floating around, but traditionally this is the one that we sing when we perform, is Süssmayr's version of the Mozart Requiem. So just a couple things. The introit, completely Mozart. So you will hear a very strong theme, you will hear a very strong motive in the strings. This comes back again at the very end during the communion. The two movements of the communion. Basically, Süssmayr just takes the musical material from the introit and the Kyrie and changes the words and what we call contrafacta or contrafactum, and puts them into those two movements. So most of his work was done already. The Kyrie was mostly Mozart, although this is where Freistetler comes into play. He helped with quite a bit of the orchestration for the Kyrie, even though the main themes were all done. Mozart had some sketches of instrumentation, but he didn't have the full instrumentation done yet. So this is where Süssmayr and his students come into play. The sequence, which of course is the Dies Irae and all of the things that follow, was basically written. Mozart had the vocal parts sketched out. He had the figured bass, so Süssmayr would have known what the chord structure was, and some sketches for orchestration, but basically this is where Süssmayr does quite a lot of work and completes the Lacrimosa. So Mozart only had about 8 to 9 measures of the Lacrimosa finished, and Süssmayr took that and made that his own, in addition to Joseph Eibler. So Joseph Eibler actually did the bulk of the Dies Irae orchestration. So this, of course, is still disputed. We're not really sure who exactly did what, but we have more and more information as sort of the years go on. The offertory was very much the same way. The vocal parts were already sketched, but he needed someone to finish the orchestration. Sanctus. The first part was sketched by Mozart, but basically Süssmayr did almost all of the orchestrations. The Benedictus was only partially finished by Mozart, and the rest was done by Süssmayr. Agnus Dei is mostly Mozart. And the Communion then, as I said, is all Süssmayr, which means he literally just copy and pasted the musical material from the 2 beginning movements and changed the words to fit with the Communion, which is the Lux Aeternam and Cum Sanctus Spiritu. So I will move on now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about orchestration. This was set very much as your typical classical master work, which is you have always had 4 soloists: soprano, mezzo, tenor, bass, and then you had 4-part chorus, SATB, and then an orchestra. The orchestra always had strings, of course, but typically in a classical orchestration setting, all the winds and the brass only have 2 players. So you'd have a first clarinet and a second clarinet, first oboe, second oboe, things like that. But in this case, Mozart did something a little different. He used a basset horn, which is like a tenor clarinet. So you can see the picture here. This is a period, picture of a period basset horn. So bent in kind of a strange way, has the embouchure similar to a clarinet, right? So single reed. But obviously the mechanism gives it a slightly darker, deeper sound. Which is what he wanted. He wanted something dark to fit with the Requiem. Then he also added bassoon, trumpet, 2 trumpets, and 3 trombones, which is going to be very, very important later as we're talking about this, and timpani, of course, strings with organ, and then continuo. Most classical orchestras, as I said, used pairs like that, so it was pretty odd to have an extra trombone. And he uses this for a little bit more color. So you'll have your alto trombone, your tenor trombone, things like that, that give it just a little bit of a scarier feeling. And this will be really important for the Dies Irae. He omitted flutes and oboes and clarinets because he thought that they were too light, really, for the content. And you can definitely hear the difference in the darker colors and the lower instruments that he used. As far as content and order, he uses the exact same formula for all requiems in the Catholic Church. So technically this could be performed in the Catholic Church during a Mass. I had a friend of mine when I was teaching in Los Angeles that passed away at the church I was working in, and he was bound and determined to have the Mozart Requiem at his funeral, and that's exactly what we did. This person also had a lot of money, so this was important to them, but it fits in perfectly with the Requiem Mass. And the particular Catholic church I was working at was extremely rigid when it came to these rules. So the Mass, Requiem Mass, fit in perfectly, but it was interesting to hear the Dies Irae at a funeral. Anyway, Count von Walsegg, as I said, wanted to claim this as his own, and he did. He did succeed. He did perform it, and wrote it off as his own composition. But eventually Süssmayr got a hold of it, released his own version, and from there it became Mozart's Requiem. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about some musical moments. So the opening, the text essentially is Requiem Aeternam, right? Which of course means forever in eternity. Even though it's in death, you are forever alive, right? So the text here, this is an interesting point. When the soprano comes in and sings Te Decut Hymnus, which is the first time we hear the soloist, this is actually a chorale tune that the Germans likely would have recognized. And he changes the mood entirely to something a little sweeter and a little lighter. And then, of course, when we get to Hear My Prayer, the orchestration gets much, much more jumbled. And in a lot of ways, people think that this is Mozart sort of mocking the church. Because even in a time when we're saying, hear my prayer, and this should be a sort of a peaceful moment, it is not peaceful at all, particularly in the orchestration. The next thing to listen for, so we're going to listen to these two movements. And the Kyrie is a double fugue. So the first theme you'll hear, Kyrie eleison, right? The second fugue will be in the Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. So you'll hear two different themes, and eventually he will blend them all together. So let's take a listen to Mozart's Requiem, the first movement, and the second movement. I might do just a tiny bit of talking over this, but for the most part, I will just let you listen. chorus is singing this in the traditional ecclesiastical Latin. Most choruses would do this in German Latin. First fugue theme and the counter fugue happening in the alto. Soprano's taking the counter fugue up the fifth. Tenors enter. Again, light percussion shines. We have a short break, and we're immediately into the Kyrie, the first fugue of the Kyrie. This is movement 2. This is the secondary fugue. Stay in it. Altos have the theme. Notice that the strings are doubling almost all of the fugue parts. They're even voices. So violin 1 usually plays what we call full aparte, the sopranos, each of the altos, viola, the tenors, the cellos and bass. So full aparte, and this is a very well taken. And the trumpet is doubling as well. That deceptive cadence. And it's very typical that Mozart would have left that final chord as an open fifth, and that goes all the way back to the Renaissance, right, where they would end every single, their chord was really just do and so. Thirds were not really a thing. So, and also by leaving it open and empty like that, it gives it the feeling of a requiem, right? That we're just starting this journey. We are not yet fulfilled. So he leaves just a little bit of open air there at the end, which is very, very powerful. Okay, let's go on to sequentia, which is a series of texts from this particular sequence. So what is a sequence? Well, essentially, and this changed many, many times over the years, but when the monks first started chanting all of these many different texts, they would add what they called a sequence. So they would add a bunch of melismas, or tropes as we call them, to make things more interesting and easier for them to remember, basically. And then eventually all of these sequences, or these tropes, needed words. So they became sequences. And these sequences are only performed on specific days. So like a feast day, for instance. Well, eventually the Catholic Church said, hey, we just got way too many sequences flying around and everybody's doing everything different, and we need to just codify this. So eventually they brought it down to only 5 sequences that happen only on certain days. For instance, another one is Victimae Paschale, which only happens on Easter Sunday, right? The Dies Irae is another sequence, and that only happens in the Requiem Mass. So we have what's called the Mass Ordinary, which is something you do every single day, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, Sanctus and Benedictus, and then the Agnus Dei. Those are performed every single day all around the world at every Catholic Mass. Then you have what we call the Mass Propers, which change depending on the day. And every single day in the Catholic Church is basically a feast day. We're celebrating some saint or something interesting like that. In this case, the Requiem Mass is only to be used as a funeral Mass. But the Dies Irae has, of course, become quite famous, mainly because of its chant setting. Dies Irae, Dies Illa, right? This is very eerie, very scary, and many composers have taken the chant part of it and incorporated it into their own musical material. And you can definitely hear a chant-like way of composing as Mozart is doing this. He's pulling from chant, not necessarily stealing the melodies per se, but it sounds like chant, particularly in the sequence. So we will start with the Dies Irae, which literally means the day of wrath, right? Judgment Day, end of the world, sort of going back to Old Testament God in a way. And this definitely sounds like it. So let's listen to the Mozart Requiem, Dies Irae. This is just one short piece of a movement. So that is the Dies Irae. Talk about a classic moment in our Western music history. That probably sums it all up right there. The orchestration, you can hear the trumpets loud and clear, trombones often doubling what the singers were doing and adding to that feeling of the day of wrath. So imagine what a trombone means to us now. Well, it's a little bit different, but back in the day, trombones, sackbuts, they're the predecessor of the trombone is called the sackbut, were used essentially, and this is because of a composer named Christoph Willibald Gluck, one of the early innovators in classical opera in the classical period, used a trombone to symbolize the underworld, or what Hades would sound like in his opera Orpheus or Orfeo. So that trombone is stuck in Mozart's brain as representing wrath, right? Representing anger, hatred, all of these, horrible feelings that are down there and beyond the gates of hell. So we definitely feel that. And those in the classical period, to us, trombones have become commonplace. They were not necessarily commonplace in a symphonic work of this nature at that time. So using three was especially jarring and certainly made quite an impact. Talking more about the trombone, the next part, and keep in mind during the sequence, these would all go one right into the other, right? There might be a short pause. I should say, too, that recording that you just heard took a retard at the end of the Dies Irae. I would not have done that, and that's because the retard really wasn't invented until the 19th century. So they wouldn't have necessarily known to do that. We sort of do that stylistically in all of our romantic pieces, so people sort of do that often, but in this particular time period there would not have been a retard, and more than likely he would have just ran right to the end as quickly as possible, and that's to get that effect, that running motive in the violins that goes all the way down. The point is that we're going down into hell, and it's not a slow climb, it's a fast way down. So just be cognizant of that as you're listening to these different recordings. Every conductor does things a little bit differently, but from a stylistic perspective, there likely would not have been a retard for that reason. Then we go right into the tuba mirum, which is the sounding of the trumpet, right, as Judgment Day. So in this case, tuba means trombone. So what Mozart has done has started the call off with a trombone, sort of in this arpeggiated motion, and then the bass soloist takes over very famously with the text of Tuba Mirum. So let's listen to this section of the sequence from Mozart's Requiem. Okay, so as you noticed, that movement is only for soloists, right? We heard that gorgeous duet between the trombone and the bass at the very beginning. And then he slowly adds in the tenor and he adds in the mezzo and the soprano, and then they sing as a quartet. What's interesting about this one is that we're talking about the Day of Judgment, right? So at the very end, we get to the last phrase, which is cum vix justus sit securus. What that means is when even the just are scarcely secure. So that whole questioning is happening, and that phrase, what they're saying in that phrase is, what then am I, a poor wretch, going to say? Which protector shall I ask for when even the just are scarcely secure? So they keep asking this question. As you probably heard, they keep repeating the same question over and over and over again. So first the soprano asks the question, then slowly he adds in the parts, and they have this, the quartet of soloists has a little duet between them and the strings, right? So it gives it a very different feeling than what we heard with the Dies Irae, and that has everything to do with the text. Now we're going to listen to Rex Tremende Majestatis, which is King of Tremendous Majesty. So you might imagine that the word Rex, meaning king, will be very strong and very loud. Let me just read the words to this so you know what we are talking about here. King of terrifying majesty, who freely saves the saved, save me, fount of pity. So let's listen to Rex Tremende. I was going to mention, when people do this, the recording that we hear does not double dot. Many people believe that it is a classical style and that everything should actually be double dotted. So in other words, it gives it a little bit more space. Rex Tremende, da-da. So faster than Rex Tremende versus like that. So there are really two different ways of doing this, and it really has to do with which classical style you subscribe to, and if you believe that that would have actually been done during the time period. That's period, what we call period practice. All right, so here is, oh, my search maybe not, didn't work. Let's look this up. Okay. I'd like to find the one with the notes. There we go. This one works well. Okay, here we go. Okay, back to the home key, right? Now I gotta find where I am. Hold, please. Okay, here we go. So, we just talked about Rex Tremende. It definitely gives a feeling of the king of most terrifying majesty, right? That, of course, is the idea. He used rests and space to create that sort of fearful sound. Now let's listen to Recordare. And here we really hear the use of that basset horn that we talked about, the tenor clarinet, if you will. And the form of this particular little movement is a lot like Sonata Allegro. So you'll hear an actual exposition, then you'll hear that theme be developed in shorter and shorter excerpts, and then the recapitulation, which basically means what we heard at the beginning comes back at the end in a similar fashion, not exactly the same, but in a similar fashion. So let's listen to Recordare. Let me just pull this up here real quick. It's nice if we can find the one. There it is with the actual notes. Keep in mind this isn't the score itself, this is the piano score, so you can't tell which instruments are playing which from this score, but at least it gives you some concept of what's actually happening. So here's the Recordare. And we're talking about remembering, merciful Jesus, that I am the cause of your sojourn. Do not cast me out on that suffered the cross, you redeemed me, may such great labor not be May that labor not be in vain. Come together at the very end. Now we're saying, just judge of vengeance, grant the gift of remission before the day of reckoning. It's a similar theme that we heard at the spare thy supplication. I say that again. My face blushes with guilt. Spare me, O and you who exalt Mary, thank you, and heeded the faith I've also given you to. tenors are not worthy. There's that theme again. But thou, good one, kindly grant that I not heard in the everlasting everlasting burning. Grant me a favored place among the sheep, and separate me from the goats, placing me at thy right hand. Back in F major, which is the relative major of D minor. Okay, so that is that beautiful movement for four soloists, and he separates that and then gives the bass and horn just a little bit of a solo there. Famously, we go on to confutatis. So confutatis is very difficult for the tenors. It's extremely high. And the men often are representing that wrath of God, and then the women come in with this heavenly singing, almost like angels, and they come in thirds. So let's listen to that, and I'll talk a little bit about the text as well. Confutatis maledictis. When the accursed are confounded, flammis acribus addictis, consigned to the fierce flames, voca me cum benedictis, call me to be with the blessed. And then it goes on to say, oro supplex et acclinis, I pray, suppliant and kneeling, cor contritum quasi cinis, my heart contrite as if it were ashes, gere curam mei finis, protect me in my final hour. So let's listen to that, and then next, of course, is the Lacrimosa, but let's listen to the confutatis first. Okay, that's a really fun movement. Like I said, especially for the tenors who've got to get way up there. Let's go on to the Lacrimosa, probably the most famous passage or movement from the Mozart Requiem is the Lacrimosa, which literally means this tearful, how tearful that day. It's famously in 12/8 meters, so it has this sort of lilting feel, even though it's still in 4. So we think of it as 1, dot, dot, 2, dot, dot, 3, dot, dot, 4, dot, dot. Then the new theme can begin, right? Listen for the difficult and disjunct string passages, which are really hard to get right. If you listen closely, you can hear the downbeats on 1 and 3, and the string playing on what we like to call the anacrusis, which gives it that haunting, beautiful feeling. So remember that Mozart only finished the first 8 or 9 bars of this, and Süssmayr did the rest. I'll just read to you the translation real quick. Oh, how tearful that day on which the guilty shall rise, from the embers to be judged. Spare them then, O God. And then we go into the Pie Jesu, merciful Lord Jesus, grant them rest. Okay, here we go. Very difficult. Also, the tempo has to be just right. And I chose this one because I feel like he doesn't take it too slow or too fast. It's the perfect. See the bass and works there and the tenor tone. Okay, and that amen at the end is all Süssmayr. That was not Mozart. So adding the amen at the end of this particular text was a little bit on the odd side, but certainly you can hear that plagal cadence, right? The plagal cadence is just going from 4, the chord structure, 4 to 1, and usually, typically that was amen, and that would end most sequences in the church. The amen would add that, but we don't often hear that in between movements, but he's essentially summing up this particular sequence and finishing it off. So he added the Amen. Okay, so then we move into the offertorium, which is really considered the next movement. So the way that they often structured these is what we call cantata style. And what they would do is take little chunks of text and set them to their own music. So it was a different way of splitting up the movements so they weren't as long. And it also gave the composer a little bit more to work with because they could do different things with different text by making little mini movements. So this is why we have, say, a large movement called the offertorium, and then we have two little movements underneath that. It's just their way of splitting up the text to give them a little bit more creative leeway. So the first text from the offertorium is Domine Jesu. You can definitely hear this contradiction between loud and soft passages here. We hear a lot of unison voice, and then homophonic choir is sort of an echo. Also listen for the fugue in this particular movement. I'll just read the text right here. Lord Jesus Christ, King of glory, liberate the souls of all the faithful departed from the pains of hell and from the deep pit. And then we go on at the Libera Eas, deliver them from the lion's mouth. Let not hell swallow them up, let them not fall into darkness. But let Michael, the holy standard bearer, bring them into the holy light. Michael, of course, is the archangel, which once thou promised to Abraham and to his seed. And typically, when we get to that final Quam olim Abrahe, promisesti, people like to use that in the fugue, and that's what you'll hear here as well. Britten did it famously in his War Requiem, so we'll talk about that in another time. Soloists take over talking about Michael. Just the cadence. All right, nice solid end in G major. So now we go on to the second part of the offertorium, which is called Ostias. And this starts with a very lilting 3/4, almost like a waltz, but quickly changes back to that same fugue again when we get back to Quam olim abrahe promisisti et semine eius. We're back to that theme that you just heard. So he brings it all the way back around to sort of finish out the offertorium. Okay, here is Ostias, which is supplication, asking for prayer. Sacrifices and prayers of praise, O Lord, we offer to thee. Receive them, Lord, on behalf of those souls that we commemorate today. Okay. The beautiful ending there with the fugue that we're already pretty much familiar with, right? So that wraps up the fourth movement. Then we go into the Sanctus. This just coincidentally is the only movement written in the sharp key. Süssmayr was very fond of D major, as were most Baroque composers like Handel. I guess you could even say Haydn was fond of D major. So this was very much in vogue in the Baroque period. Bach wrote a lot in D major. So he moved this to a brighter key, so what we would like to call the relative major. So we're in D minor, right? This is the Requiem in D minor, and parallel. He uses the parallel major. So we have certainly here another 3/4 section, as we often do when dealing with Hosanna in the highest, right? He does the exact same thing. It's very reminiscent of the fugue that we just heard. So let's listen to Sanctus from the Mozart Requiem. And of course we're talking holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of Swede. And then of course we go immediately into, with no break, the Benedictus, because the Sanctus and the Benedictus are paired together. Typically though, during this time period, the Benedictus would have only been sung by soloists, and Mozart is no exception. So he takes this particular movement, slows it way down, makes it a very peaceful, sort of pleading sound, because what you're saying here is, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and then Hosanna in the highest. So we'll wrap it up with the exact same fugue that we just heard in the Sanctus. So this is the Benedictus, featuring the 4 soloists. soft is very typical of the period. We did not have mezzo forte, mezzo piano. We really just had loud and soft. Also, the accent usually falls upon the beat, so the grace note comes at the top instead of the fourth, which happens in the next century. A little fugal action here. It's really important too that cease is extremely short at the end, but not accented. Okay, we're just about done here, but let's talk about the Agnus Dei. Agnus Dei, of course, Lamb of God, take away our sins, grant us peace. And we say Agnus Dei 3 times, and of course 3 times is reminiscent of the Holy Trinity. So almost everything we do, we say in threes or multiples of 3. Here in this particular movement, it is all what we call homophonic, which means everyone sings the same words at the same time, just in different harmonies. But it is in a minor key, which gives it a little bit more of an eerie tone. And a lot of that has to do with how to offset what we just heard, which was fairly positive, fairly major in major keys, right? And so this is a little bit of contrast for you. Here is the Agnus Dei. section in the Requiem that has changed that I just mentioned. Dona eis Requiem sempiternam, which means grant them rest everlasting. Deceptive cadence. So as I said before, earlier I was mistaken. I said it was Dona nobis pacem. That is the regular Mass. So if we were just doing the Mass ordinary, or composers, as they have done many times in the past, set the actual Mass, the Agnus Dei ends with Dona nobis pacem. In the case of the Requiem, it ends with Dona eis Requiem sempiternam, which means grant them rest everlasting. So all those little changes for a Mass that is for a specific feast day. Going now to the final movement, communion. This is all Süssmayr, but he just took Mozart's content and just changed the words. So that's what we call contrafactum or contrafacta, where we use the same music but different words. And this is really a masterly level of doing such a thing, that Süssmayr could take the Lux Aeterna and the Cum Sanctis Tuis and put them together in such a way that they match the beginning of the piece. So the whole piece has this sort of cyclical feel. So let's listen to these two final movements. Keep in mind the Cum Sanctis, of course, has a fugue at the end, reminiscent of the Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, exact same musical content as before. So let's finish out this piece with the communion. Lux Aeterna, of course, is light eternal. So recognize the music. This is the exact same as the beginning. And finally, we cadence with Quia pius est, and you are merciful. And we end, of course, with that open fifth in D minor, and that is the end. So he doesn't finish the rest of the Requiem text. But what is important to note is that in the communion at the very, very end, we start again with something very similar. Lux eterna. In the first movement, we said lux perpetua, right? Light perpetual. Now we're saying light eternal. So it's slightly different. And this is the only time that we actually have a little bit of a verse that follows the antiphon. So the antiphon, lux eterna luceat eis Domine, may light eternal shine upon them, O Lord, cum sanctis tuis in aeternum, with saints in the company of thy saints forever and ever. And that's the final line he uses for the fugue, right? And then at the very end, quia pius est, for thou art merciful. But after that, we heard Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine et lux perpetua luceat eis, which is taken from the introit, right? So that happens right after that verse. And then, of course, Süssmayr decides to end with the cum sanctis tuis in aeternum quia pius est. So that is about it in terms of notable moments. There are obviously many, many more, but that's all I'm going to talk about. Today we could go on and on and on in all the ways that that is just a remarkable piece. But a couple things to note. It was performed for Mozart by just a couple of singers at his bedside the day before he died, so he had a chance to hear a little bit of what it would sound like. As I said, Count von Walsegg did do his own performance. And lastly, of course, when Süssmayr finished it, then it became really Süssmayr's performance. He led the charge, conducted it, etc., etc. And keep in mind, too, that a conductor is not really the same as what we have today. The composer likely would have led from the organ or the keyboard. And that was traditionally how that was done in Mozart's day. It wasn't really till Mendelssohn that things started to actually happen in terms of conducting. But that's all I have for you guys today. I hope that this was informative for you. I'm going to add a few questions if you want to go through them on your own. Nothing is due per se, but I'm going to add a couple questions in the discussion area of EduCat, and maybe we can get some discussions going, or if you have any more questions for me, I'll do my best to answer them. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening, for coming to my TED Talk, and I hope that we'll see you again. I'm sorry if my dog was barking. I also have 2 dogs and 2 cats, and working from home is a challenge. Not as challenging as it might be with children, I surmise, but it's similar in that they make a lot of noise. So I apologize if you heard dogs barking or someone mowing the lawn. That was my boyfriend, and I'm just happy he was mowing the lawn. So anyway, thank you so much, and I hope to see you again next time.